We are live. Thank you for showing up here today. As many of you probably already know, I produce quite a bit of content for aspiring instructional designers. So you've probably come across the super long article about how to become an ID, and I have a growing YouTube playlist about how to become an instructional designer. So since we're here live, this will be a live Q&A. We will hopefully cover some things that aren't already covered in those two places. But yeah, happy to answer everyone's questions and hopefully provide some clarity here. I will ask that you try to use the Ask a Question tab at the bottom to ask your questions, because it will probably be difficult for me to keep up with the chat. But hello, everyone. I see a lot of familiar faces, and we have a good turnout today. So I'm excited to dive into this. All right, so I'm going to just answer the questions with the most upvotes, and we will work our way down. So we have a question from Carlin Way about the importance of developing an instructional design portfolio if you're looking to transition into the field. Do I have any advice on how to search for relevant projects or items to include within the portfolio? And do they usually come from your current professional role or elsewhere? So this is a good question, Carlin. I actually have a YouTube video launching on Monday about creating your portfolio. But this is a really good topic because, like Carlin pointed out, your portfolio is going to do the heavy lifting when it comes to landing a job. I mean, that's how it was for me. Like, for people who don't know, I started my freelance business right when I started my master's program. And I knew from what I've seen all of the other people in the field saying, like, you need a portfolio. So I got that portfolio up like as soon as possible, and it landed me on my first client on Upwork, and then it just ballooned from there. But none of that would have happened at all if I didn't have the portfolio website. So I do have a lot of advice about which projects to include. I mean, I actually run a portfolio bootcamp, so we've been diving very deep into this topic for the last couple of months. I suggest doing this like flagship project piece as like the first project on your portfolio. And that project is your opportunity to really show off your demand of the instructional design process. So this isn't going to be like the very first thing you're creating, probably, if you're just going at this on your own. But yeah, I would suggest including a flagship project where you can show that you can use your instructional design skill set to solve a real world problem, okay? And the source for this real world problem would be your current role or a past role. So an example I give is, like I worked in customer service when I was like an undergrad in college. So if I were to design this flagship project, I would think, okay, what is a problem that these customer service agents face? Like, what is a real world problem? And we want to find a problem that's caused by a gap in skill or knowledge. What's something that these people don't know or don't know how to do? Because those are the types of problems that instructional design can solve. And I know that this is kind of repetitive for people who have already been following me about all these portfolio topics, but that's the first thing I would want I would suggest having in your portfolio, because that's what differentiates you just from someone who can use Storyline and create e-learning. Versus, it positions you more as someone who knows how to actually use instructional design to solve problems. And those problems are gaps in knowledge and skill. Like, that's what we solve as instructional designers. We don't just throw information into e-learning courses, in an ideal world, at least. So that's the flagship project. You're going to talk about that whole process and actually, show how you solve something with your skill set. The other projects, what I call the supporting projects, those are your opportunities to like hone in on more specific like specializations. So maybe if you're really into development, you can show off some really complex interactions you developed in Storyline, or how you added custom code to those things. If you really like the instructional design and analysis side, maybe you can do some write-ups about analyses you've conducted. But if your job is just if your goal is just to get a job, I would suggest creating these as your supporting projects, creating some nice, visually appealing e-learning interactions, because that is what so much of the work is out there is. Like, you've probably seen from job listings, companies are looking for people that can use Storyline. Like they want everything else too, but a lot of people's day-to-days in instructional design roles are to work with the subject matter experts, write out storyboards or scripts or whatever that storyboard looks like, and then actually go and design and develop the thing in Storyline. So when people are evaluating portfolios, it is really nice to show these visually appealing like interactions that you've built with Storyline, because it gives you credibility for one of these most in-demand skill sets, I would say. And again, for better or worse, happy to discuss that further. But Carlin, yeah, just for your question, when you're coming up with that main portfolio project, think about problems you've experienced either in your current professional role or in previous ones, and identify a problem you can solve with instructional design, and then actually proceed to design and develop that solution. And that's what you show off. And in your write-up, you talk about all of that and your process and your role and responsibilities. A really good way to get credibility for a lot of positions. So hope that helps. All right, and I'm sorry, I'm not following this chat because I'm talking here. So I'm just going to be looking at this Ask a Question tab. So add your questions there. That's what we'll be focusing on. And I also wanted to say, like, I know there are some people here who already know about this stuff because they've been following me for a while, or people who have been in instructional design for years. Like, feel free to share what you know, like in the chat. Like, I'm sure there are many other IDs here who can help the people in the audience, and it looks like some are already doing that. So yeah, feel free to share. Like, I think that will be helpful for people getting other perspectives. All right, we have a question from Rick about, Rick is planning to make a career shift. Rick is a classroom teacher, but would like to explore the corporate world. I think that's the boat that a lot of aspiring IDs are in. There are so many instructional designers moving from the classroom to corporate instructional design because better salaries, better work-life balance. So good goal. I think there are many classroom teachers who have successfully made that transition and are much happier now. So yeah, your question is, what experiences do you need to be qualified as an instructional designer for these companies? This is a good question. I think we can flip that question a little bit. I don't think it's necessarily what experiences do you need. I think it's more about what skills you need. Okay, so you can worry about experiences and like, I know this is like the corporate world, like you must have 5 years of experience. People ask all the time, is that a hard requirement? No, like it's not. If you have a solid portfolio that actually shows off your instructional design skills, whether it's 5 years experience, 1 year experience, or 8 years of experience, you're going to have a very good shot at landing some of those roles, because I mean, that's what people really care about, right? I mean, other than if you're just like some kind of automated like resume checker, has this person been working for at least 8 years? Like if you can see a nice portfolio, it's going to go much further at getting you credibility and helping you actually land opportunities. So I'm going to interpret this question as which skills you need to be qualified as an instructional designer. I think the basic ones are you a good writer? Like, can you write with proper grammar and concisely? And yeah, that's important. There are some foundational instructional design skills, like writing good learning objectives, writing good questions, and then like just understanding like alignment. Like, are your questions, your content, your objectives, is everything in perfect alignment? Because you're not going to be a very good instructional designer if you're including all this extra information or random questions just for the sake of adding them because you think they're interesting, if they're not supporting the instructional goal. So that's an important skill to have. And then, as many people are finding, these development skills are so important right now, like for landing a job, right? I mean, again, for better or worse, like I think, okay, Dan, business acumen is very important for a corporate ID role as well. Like, business acumen is probably, yeah, one of the best ways that you could differentiate yourself. But just from what I see on job postings, and I keep an eye on them fairly frequently, and I talk to a lot of people who work in the field, and yeah, a lot of IDs are more, churning out courses, for better or worse. So business acumen is necessary if you're going to help lead the change and help bring our industry to a place that is more performance and results oriented. And that, that is how we actually produce value as instructional designers. But maybe we'll get into this more later. But yeah, a lot of roles right now are so focused on like producing content, producing e-learning content. So if your main goal is to land work and to have a job that pays the bills and has a good salary, yeah, I mean, getting down those the core instructional design skills and some core development skills, like some visual design and storyline skills, that's going to get your foot in the door. And then once you get in there and you start churning out those courses and realizing, wow, like I feel like I'm not having much of an impact, maybe then you can really start diving into some more performance consulting approaches and try to drive change within your org about how to actually produce value. So that's a very big discussion and idea and an important one at that, I would say. So yeah, Rick, I hope that answered your question. Feel free to add follow-up questions to that. All right, we have a question from Agni. Maybe you could share some projects that you did that you would not consider successful. Why was it not successful and what would you do now differently? Good question. I feel like I can take this in a couple of different ways. So the first way I'll take it, which I feel like is a bit more on topic, is I do a lot of e-learning development work for clients. So I'll be partnered with a performance consultant or an instructional designer, and they'll give me a storyboard or a script, and then my role is to just convert that storyboard or script into the end product. Okay, so maybe some visual concerns, but mostly like programming it and making sure that everything works as it's intended. Now, some of the projects that I work on, maybe a lot of them, especially in the past, I kind of know that project isn't going to make a very big impact at the organization. Like so a lot of these e-learning projects are like what a lot of people refer to as like info dumps or information dumps, where the whole goal is, yeah, let's just present all this information and push this on our audience and they'll learn it. And then they'll take the test at the end of the lesson or the end of the course to prove that they learned it. That's what like the vast majority of e-learning work out there is. It's not the most effective work though. And like you kind of know, like especially if you go through like a master's program or something, you learn about this performance consulting approach and how to produce results and conduct all of these analyses. But when you get into the field, you find out that a lot of that isn't actually being done. Instead, it's, people higher up in the organization saying, we need this training. It's passed down to project managers. It's passed down to instructional designers. And your job then is to actually make the training. So I've been involved in a lot of projects that were successful from the front, that I got them done on time, on budget, and turned them around and everything worked perfectly. But the project overall, I don't think would be very successful in producing any kind of meaningful change or results for the organization. And we wouldn't never know because evaluation also isn't usually conducted in practice. So I hope that I'm not scaring anyone away from the field. Like the field definitely needs like bright minds, and you're definitely going to make good money and stuff while you're dealing with all of these issues. But yeah, our field has some ways to go on actually producing value for orgs. And that's where the business acumen comes in, the analysis skills. Because if that part isn't done correctly, then the whole project overall is like maybe not going to be super successful. Dan says, sad state of affairs, Devlin. Yeah, you could say that, I guess. But obviously there are people doing good work out there. I have been involved in some projects that did have a really strong upfront analysis, and they are being tracked to metrics. So there is some good out there. A lot of it isn't so amazing. So that is that. I see people sharing good resources, good stuff in there. And another project, Agni, I think wasn't successful for me. And I'm a freelancer, but one of my early projects, I just basically was very naive and signed a contract that had very loose deliverables. And I got roped into being pressured to do magnitudes more work than I was told it would be before I signed the contract. So it was tough. Like what I would have done differently is definitely negotiated the contract better and ironed out the deliverables more clearly in that contract. But having that experience and spending dozens of hours negotiating and, just dealing with that whole situation and working way more than I expected to, like, that was not a success. But the lessons I took away from it have been very helpful going forward, because when you're in a situation like that, you're like, I'm never letting this happen again. And it definitely changes how you approach projects in general. So I hope that helps. All right. We have a question from Kelsey. When interviewing, what are some questions to ask the interviewer at the end of the interview that have to do with the instructional design position? So this is a good question. I'm just going to throw out some ideas here. So one thing I would be curious about is, what is the breakdown of that position? I mean, a lot of people here are probably familiar with ADDIE, so analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. Most instructional design roles, like, your responsibilities are going to fall anywhere across that range, right? Like, most of them fall in design and development. So you'll be meeting with SMEs, writing learning objectives, writing storyboards or scripts, and then actually developing it in your authoring tool of choice. So that's where most of these positions fall. Some of them, they tack implementation onto that. So you'll be an LMS administrator, actually getting these learning experiences in front of the right audiences. And you'll have to, be kind of like LMS support, and in addition to those other things. I found this complaint a lot from instructional designers at smaller companies, where they're expected to literally do it all. It's like one instructional designer, and they have to do the LMS, the design, the development, maybe some analysis, which usually looks more like an intake form where people can submit requests for training and you just do it. But again, that's a place where you probably would have some agency to evaluate whether or not that training is really necessary or will help solve the real problem at hand. So that's what I would ask, like, know what you're getting into. Like, are you just going to be a designer and you're turning out these storyboards, or are you going to do like the full scope of the process? Like, get a feel for what that position will actually look like. Some other questions. Maybe ask some questions about evaluation efforts. I mean, I don't know if that would be risky, because I don't know if you'd be like putting them on the defensive, because again, like, evaluation in a lot of cases is like, once a year we'll look at the feedback we may or may not be collecting and maybe make some changes based off of it. But that could show that you are thinking about evaluation and thinking about how you can use data to improve your offerings accordingly. You can also similarly ask about analysis efforts, like, how do you determine which learning experiences to create? Like, how do you determine where you're devoting your efforts? Like, what does the analysis process look like? And maybe asking what kind of access you have to your audience. Like, are you going to have access to the audience to interview them? Maybe conduct focus groups. Like, whether or not, like, in practice, it might be a lot of like content creation. But the more you can position yourself and talk about using instructional design to solve real business problems and to do it the right way with analysis and evaluation and getting how every step of that comes together, like, that's going to differentiate you and give you more credibility in these interviews. And I think will really help you seal the deal. Because what I've seen in these job listings, like, a lot of people want someone who can like do it all. But in practice, it's really a lot of, well, right now we're churning out e-learning, but we would like to improve in the future. So if you position yourself as someone who can help them tie their efforts to business metrics and stuff like Dan was saying, and have that business acumen, that's going, in most cases, I think that will really set you apart and help you seal the deal in interviews, assuming you already have those foundational skills that you'll need to actually do the job in the moment. Hope that helps. All right. So Marta, hello Marta. Marta's asking, what tool do I use for storyboarding? And can I show an example of a storyboard and how I develop it in Storyline? I don't know if we'll have time to get into examples. I see we've come up to 35 questions in the queue. So I don't think I'll get into screen sharing and pulling stuff up here just because of the sake of time. I keep my storyboards now for my clients very, very simple. And some people here who are in the portfolio bootcamp have seen these, but it's literally just like a Word document. okay, or a Google Doc. So it's a Google Doc. I use like bolding and coloring and stuff pretty well. I have programming notes where necessary, but it's just like a script basically. That's what I get sign off on from my clients, and once that's approved, we go ahead and move into development. Now, when I was doing more subcontracting and working more as like an order taker with less agency, and I have to fit into these other processes, I have used quite a few different storyboards. I mean, some storyboard templates are very closely tied to Gagne's 9 events. So if you're not familiar with that, Gagne has these 9 conditions for learning, and you can make a pretty solid storyboard template just by trying to address each of those conditions. So like gaining attention, stimulating like prior knowledge, presenting the objectives, like providing practice and feedback. Like they're all 9 of those you can turn into a template and make a pretty comprehensive learning experience. And I would really suggest looking into Gagne's 9 events if you're very new to instructional design, just because it does give you a pretty good blueprint to creating a learning experience. I know it really helped me when I was very early in my master's program, like with not much experience creating lesson plans at the time. All right, I'm seeing more questions come in. Just remember, add them to the queue, and we'll get to whatever is most upvoted. Okay, so a question from Hannah. What advice would I give to classroom teachers who are trying to transition into the field and find that first job as an instructional designer? Do we need to tailor our resume to meet the requirements of the job, or do we start with entry-level ID jobs? What would be good first steps? Hannah, I think the first priority should be getting a portfolio together. Okay, like I've seen a lot of people post about not having luck finding instructional design jobs. Okay, I've seen teachers post about not having luck with interviews. I've seen people who have master's degrees in instructional design have trouble getting interviews. I've seen people with years of instructional design experience have trouble getting interviews, but I've never seen someone talk about having trouble getting interviews or landing a job who had a portfolio. So when someone comes to me and says, I'm having trouble getting a job or finding work, always my first question is, do you have a portfolio? Okay. Like for me, like my success has always been directly tied to the state of my portfolio. And that's true for a lot of people in this industry, at least until you start building up enough content or expertise to not really need the portfolio anymore. But so my advice is, instead of worrying about applying to all these entry-level ID jobs and hoping that someone will take you just on the merit of your experience as a classroom teacher, which is going to be hard and difficult, like with that experience, there is a lot of overlap. But what I would say to do is to show how your experience as a teacher has made you a good instructional designer by putting together a solid portfolio with at least one project in it, okay? You know, get your hands on with the tool. Learning Storyline is a good place to start, okay? So Storyline, you can start like a 60-day free trial. Just play around in the tool every evening or every time you get whenever you get some time, because this tool is used in so many jobs right now, and having that skill in your portfolio will be important. Saying, oh yeah, I wrote lesson plans for my class, like that's fine, but if you don't make the hiring manager or these recruiters confident that you can actually use the tool for the job, which is in most cases Storyline or a very similar e-learning authoring tool, you're going to have a hard time, you know, getting them to trust you enough to hire you over someone who already has a portfolio and can show off that they're using the skills needed for the job. Oh, that was a mouthful. So yeah, that's the first step. Start learning an e-learning authoring tool like Articulate Storyline, just because that one's the most popular and it's pretty easy to get started with. It's just like PowerPoint, and start trying to get a portfolio site up so that you can show off some work samples. And then once you have a portfolio site up with at least one project on it, then you can start applying to jobs. Maybe entry level, but there are tons of people who get jobs that ask for 5 years of ID experience just with a solid portfolio. And I've heard that echoed since I was breaking into the field, and it's what I found to be true, both myself and helping others. So don't worry so much about the experience, worry more about the skills. I think that's, maybe have that be your biggest takeaway if you're going through this right now. Like, you need the knowledge and theory too, especially like to get the bigger picture view of how instructional design can solve problems. And yeah, bonus points if you can show off that understanding in your portfolio with a project that's solving a real problem. Okay, feel free to add more questions to the queue if you need clarification on any of that. Okay, Anton, how to determine the right pricing strategy when you start as a freelance ID? Okay, this seems like it might be better suited for a freelance convo, but I mean, I got started as a freelancer. I never worked a full-time instructional design job, so I think it is relevant. And I don't think there's an easy answer. My first job was like an Upwork fixed price thing. It was like $200 per micro learning module, which was like super, super low, but I was able to use it in my portfolio. So I wanted to, kickstart my freelance journey. This is like a week or two after I started my master's program. So I didn't have a lot of say in that. The next project, it was a connection I made from my university, and it's someone who had been in the field for decades. And she said, yeah, I could use some e-learning development help. Like, how much will you charge me to do e-learning for about 60 minutes? Here's basically what it will look like. Like, how much will it be? Okay. So I had to give a fixed price. I couldn't say, hourly. I didn't know how many hours it would take me because I was so new. So that was very nerve-wracking and difficult. I think I looked up like every possible resource I could about pricing. I talked to my professors, and I mean, there are different strategies you can use, right? Like, I'm not going to dive super far into those. Like, I don't price hourly anymore, but generally, there are ways you can extrapolate an hourly rate or a daily rate from like your desired salary or your current salary. So you can look up those things. Just look up like hourly rate calculator or something like that. But the tough thing is when you're pricing fixed. And I remember talking to my professor, I'm like, I don't want to insult this consultant by saying a price that's too high. Like, they know I'm getting started. They know I'm a master's student. I don't want to insult them or lose this lead or opportunity. And something that really stuck with me that I think about and I try to share with others is that you also don't want to insult people by pricing yourself too low. Okay, like, price obviously carries a lot of, like, how you price yourself communicates a lot about the quality of work you produce. Okay, and a simple example is like with wines. Oh, I want to buy the $50 bottle of wine or the $10 bottle of wine. The $50 or $100 one like must be better, right? Like, that's how a lot of people think, like these heuristics, more expensive equals higher quality. So if you come back and if you price yourself too low for something and say an hourly that's like really low or a project price that's really low, unless the person already knows like you can produce really good work and they're just like amazed, like, wow, like I'm hitting a home run here. How am I getting this for this price? Like, you could negatively impact your brand or your image by pricing too low. So that's what I'll say about that. Pricing is difficult. You'll get better with experience, and the more demand there are for your services, the higher you can price your services. So hope that helps. All right. We have another question from Rick. Can't afford to buy an authoring app, and subscription services are pricey too. What alternatives do I have? Can you be hired as an instructional designer without being an expert in these authoring tools? It is possible to be hired as an instructional designer without authoring tool expertise, but you're going to need to really build your expertise in storyboarding and writing and objectives, and the pool of opportunities you'll be eligible for will be much, much lower. Because there are some like production houses or teams where the instructional designers do the instructional design and create a storyboard, and then they hand that storyboard off to the e-learning developers. That is not the norm. So by learning an authoring tool, you will be greatly increasing your odds at actually landing paid work if that's your primary goal. Now, when you're learning the tool, you don't need to buy the authoring tool. It's like, just use a Storyline free trial. It's a 60-day trial. And I know a lot of people, once that trial runs out, they do the trial again with a different email address. I don't know Articulate's particular stance on that. I know it is very common, and they don't like block your IP address or block your machine. It's just based off of the email address you use. So I would definitely not suggest doing any paid work on a trial tool. Like, definitely pay for it at that point. But if you're just learning the tool, use the free trials. Don't worry about spending $1,000 a year to learn the tool to land a job. And when you actually get the job, if it's a full-time employer, they're going to get you the licenses you need to do your work. So take advantage of those free trials. Okay, we have a question from Elsa. Elsa says she's always been reluctant about having a personal website. This might be something I have to just get over since it seems so useful as an ID. Do you happen to know any examples of very minimal but good portfolios? Something simple to start with before expanding it or gaining more experience. I would say you would benefit from having a personal site. And I don't know, I mean, I'm curious why you're reluctant about having one. Like, that seems like it would be interesting to explore and get to the bottom of. But you don't need to be super personal on your personal site, if that makes sense. Like, it is good having a picture of yourself on there just because it can help you, like it can help you get trust with whoever is looking at your site because they can see who you are, and like it helps matching a face to a name. But that's not even necessary. You can just have a very simple logo. You don't even need a picture of yourself. You don't need to dive into anything personal like your family or your hobbies or anything like that. Just think of it as a way to feature your work, right? And talk about the value that you can provide to an organization or a potential client. So as far as very simple portfolios, I mean, I know, well, I mean, one portfolio you can look at is go to joesteuben.com. So I think he's going to be on the Crowdcast sometime in the next couple of months, but he transitioned from university professor to curriculum developer at Amazon Web Services. He got his portfolio together and got the job in 6 months. So from when he first heard of ID to landing that paid job, it was literally 6 months time. And so his portfolio is pretty minimal. He has like a flagship project where he did like a branching scenario and added XAPI and stuff. Wow, Joe Steuben is how you heard about me. Awesome. Cool. Yeah, Joe is awesome. And I know he's probably very busy at Amazon now. But that's a pretty minimal site. You can get it together relatively quickly. He has some content on there, but you don't need that. You can literally just do a one-page website that has who you are, some work samples, and those link to pages that talk about your process, and then some contact information at the bottom. That's all you really need on your portfolio site. So it doesn't need to be anything amazing. Cool. All right. We have a question from Vandana. I'm a career changer from HR recruiter to ID. I have a few questions. So what kind of topics should I put up in my portfolio? So I hope we covered that. Like, at least make one of your samples about solving a real world problem with instructional design and use your industry or professional knowledge to identify that problem. Because the more realistic it is, the better. Should I put HR related topics because I come from that background? I'd say, yeah, drawing from your HR experience would probably be good just because that's the area you know best, and you can really draw on real world examples from there to like make the if you're doing like a scenario based experience, you can make it more realistic. But you don't have to do that. Like, unless you want to focus on work in the HR space, like for an HR audience, you don't need your whole portfolio to be HR e-learning projects. Like, if you're just looking for a job like across industries, it probably is good to keep it a bit varied. And what would be a realistic approach to my first job? I think we've answered that by now, but yeah, build those solid projects, get a portfolio site up, and really immerse yourself in this instructional design community. Like, get on LinkedIn. There are tons of people sharing really good information and providing learning experiences for other instructional designers. Like, just immerse yourself in this space, read an article every day, like see what conversations are happening on LinkedIn, and maybe start engaging once you feel like you're ready to. Like, yeah, I think that's the best way. Like, just immerse yourself in this. It will feel overwhelming at first, but with each month that goes by, you're not really going to recognize like where you were a month ago, just because of how rapid, just because of how rapid you can learn about this stuff once you're immersed in it. All right, we have another question about transitioning from teaching to instructional design. What would I say is the general time frame it takes to acquire the skills and develop a portfolio before one is ready to apply for jobs? At a meet and greet, someone said most of the work is freelance and temporary contracts. Is that true? So general time frame, like I don't know how I can answer that anyway other than it depends. Like if you're just working on this in the evenings for like an hour or two a day, it's going to be very different than someone who's, you know, who's unemployed and is spending 4 to 8 hours a day getting their portfolio together and learning all of this stuff. So it really will depend. I would say honestly, it's a tough call to go from nothing to actually landing a job. I would say 6 months is probably a good estimate. If you already have been learning these skills, like you already know some storyline, you know some instructional design skills, and like you just need to actually build the projects in the portfolio, you could probably do that in, I would say, a few months. So like 3 months or so would be a good estimate for that amount of time, if you already kind of know your stuff, so to speak. And then I'm sure other people it could take up to a year. Some people might do it in a couple of months. I mean, it depends on how picky you are with the opportunities you're after. Like it obviously depends on a lot. So I don't think I can give a super specific example there. Most of the work is freelance and temporary contracts. Is that true? I don't think so. I mean, if you go on Indeed, like there are so many new instructional design like jobs posted every day. There are a bunch of contracts posted. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of freelance work, but that work obviously varies a lot in quality. So like it's a lot easier if you like, it is way easier, I guess I would say, to land a full-time job than to build a successful freelance business making the same amount of money. And the reason for that is because it's not just like once you get your portfolio together, you have to actually drive traffic to it to land the work. So when you're looking for full-time jobs, you just put that portfolio link at the top of your resume, and then everyone who looks at your resume, they're going to check out that portfolio and see what kind of work you can do. You impress one person, and you know, as long as you interview well, you're going to probably have a very good shot at landing that job. If you're a freelancer, you're not just like sending your resume out to someone with that portfolio link at the top, and those listings aren't always easy to find. Like when someone's looking for a freelancer, they don't make a posting on Indeed. They're going to ask their network, right? They're going to use Google and just search for freelancers. So it's a lot harder getting the systems in place to generate reliable leads for freelance work than it is for full-time work. Now, contracts, those are kind of a mix of the two, right? Like you should still have freedom where you can set your own hours and work on your time, because by nature of being a contractor, your employer isn't able to tell, assuming you're a 1099 contractor, if you're in the States, like you can't be told you have to work 9 to 5. Like I think that's like literally illegal. So that's a good middle ground. I did some contracts to get started, like year-long contracts where I could still work my hours, you know, assuming I can make meetings. And then I could also grow my systems and land smaller freelance projects on the side. But there's a ton of full-time work out there. So I definitely would not be concerned about not being able to find a full-time job if you have a good portfolio together and you know your stuff. I haven't heard of someone having a hard time finding a job with those things in place. All right, Chelsea, what would I recommend looking for when searching for a master's program in instructional design? Good question. I get a lot of questions about master's programs, and I have not done a ton of research on all the different ones. My suggestion, which is a suggestion that has been passed down to me and I hear many other people say, is to choose a program based on like the theory and the principles that you're going to learn, not a program that's going to teach the tech skills. And the reason for this is because the tech skills are changing so frequently, or at least I guess they have been for decades in the past, and I'm assuming will continue to do so. Although it seems like this rapid e-learning, like articulate storyline is like king right now, there's a lot of discontent with the state of slide-based e-learning. So imagining a better future for the industry, we're going to move away from tools like that. So yeah, focus on the underpinnings, like performance consulting, like how are we using instructional design skills to solve real problems? That's what I would say. And look at the reputation, of course, like see what people have to say about it, see what placement is like. Again, I don't have a ton to share about this. I'm sure I will research it more in the future and produce some content on it, just because it is a common question. But if you're just trying to land a job in the corporate space, the master's degree isn't a necessity because of the current state of things. So hope that helps. Elliot asks, what does the training/development job market look like? Would I recommend an aspiring ID invest in training for entrepreneurship or business development, or are they likely to be working in contract positions? Elliot, I think I'm going to interpret this question as like, are you working a lot directly for these big brands and these big businesses, and you're kind of operating as a business, or are you operating as like this employee contractor who's just doing what they're told? That's how I'm going to interpret that. I think the more business acumen you can develop, and developing those entrepreneurship skills are like definitely sound like a good idea, and responding to those market needs. Like when I first started, I thought that as a freelancer, I'd always be stuck in these subcontracting positions where these bigger agencies are paying me to just do one piece of it. But since this year, after rehauling my portfolio, adding some social proof on there, some logos for companies I've worked with, I started getting leads from much bigger companies and companies that I actually know of and that people actually hear about. So, and if you look at other successful freelancers, they work directly with these big clients too. So, the better you get with speaking to your clients and positioning yourself to attract direct clients, like that is definitely possible. So again, contract positions are good for getting started if you want to be independent, just because they afford some of that freedom, but they also give you more of that stability because you're going to be working on it for 6 months or a year. But those are usually hourly rate, lower value positions. So you can make doing one freelance project, which maybe takes you 50 or 100 hours, and what you would make in like 6 months doing like 600 hours of contract work. So the sooner you can get that higher value, like fixed price work directly with the end client, probably the better. So I hope that gets at your question. Wow, we have a very similar question from Taddy. I feel stuck being an instructional systems designer on government contracts. It's not the type of content I want to create. My work has limited creativity and I wouldn't share it on my portfolio. What are the first few steps I should take to freelancing on the side? Taddy, I can definitely relate to this. I've been in this situation. I was feeling super burned out and super just like over instructional design, and doing what I said and like really focusing on my site and how I position myself. Like it has definitely helped me land better quality leads where I can pitch the idea for how we're going to approach this problem and use some creativity in the solution. I mean, I'm still somewhat frustrated by this though. Like a lot of leads, they come to me and they want someone to make this information dump e-learning, and I'm not really interested in that. Like if I'm doing e-learning development work and someone wants to give me a storyboard, I can do that all day. But when I have to use my creative like instructional design and writing skills, it's really hard for me to do that on a project I don't believe is going to actually help people. And I imagine that's kind of how you're feeling as well. So first few steps, like it's not easy. Like the step is to like build your credibility, like build your brand, because that's how you're going to get the higher value stuff. And that's how you're going to get the trust to use, your direction. Like I was frustrated. I'm like, oh, I have this master's degree. Like, why aren't people trusting me? Even though I'm like just out of school, like we can do this a better way. But a master's degree doesn't cut it. The people who find you and come to you and want to hire you, those are the people who are going to trust you to take their problem and solve it in the best way. So when you're always like putting your name into things and applying for contract positions, you're kind of like a commodity because your application is right there next to 50 other applications. So I guess like by building your brand and your credibility, you reduce the amount of competition, and that's how you're going to get to some of that higher value stuff. So I hope that helps. Okay. We have a question from Agni. How do you determine the right strategy or concept for an e-learning solution? How do you avoid thinking at the end, oh my, we went completely in the wrong direction? What are the questions to ask a client? What are the factors to consider? So Agni, some of my screening questions are like, are we doing this project to present information or to improve performance, right? because good instructional design projects, the actual goal will be to improve performance in some way in the corporate space. We don't just want to teach people stuff for the sake of teaching people stuff. We want to teach people stuff so that they can actually perform better, like change their behavior in some way so that it results in, improvements to the business metrics, or the business making more money, or employees operating more efficiently for some kind of business result. So those are like the right kind of instructional design projects. Again, most projects aren't like that. Because of the state of our industry, a lot of these people will say, oh yeah, we want to present information. We need a good, course on this thing to teach people this info because we say so. So I don't know if that's what you were asking. So like when you're starting, especially as a freelancer, you can't be super picky and say, I'm only going to work on the stuff that improves performance, because you're not going to be making any money unless you get super lucky. So you have to use your judgment in some cases and, bite the bullet. And sometimes you have to take on those projects you aren't proud to have in your portfolio until you have enough of a buffer, enough savings, enough of a brand to have more freedom and to make, to say no to more people without having to worry about keeping the lights on. So how to determine the right strategy for an e-learning solution? So the right strategy would be conducting an analysis and learning more about the problem, and first determining, like, can we even solve this problem with a learning experience? Is this a problem caused by a lack of skill or knowledge? And if so, the next piece you're saying here, so that's determining if a learning solution is right. Determining if an e-learning solution is right, you want to say, like, is my audience geographically dispersed? Like, is my audience somewhat comfortable with technology, or will it be a ton of friction trying to bring this together? Because if your whole audience is in the same office and they have relatively the same schedules, it might be easier to just do a face-to-face session. You can get more interaction there. That might make more sense for the project. So I'm sure there are some great resources that dive deeper into what e-learning is right for, but I don't think we're going to turn this into a presentation on that. But hopefully that gives you enough to start thinking about these things. A question from Jamie. I have seen many previous teachers make the jump to ID, but I haven't seen much of a variety of other professionals doing the same. As someone with a non-educational background in social work, what suggestions do you have for me and others in my situation? So Jamie, having an education background or being a teacher is definitely not some kind of like prerequisite to becoming an instructional designer. There is some overlap, particularly with like lesson planning and maybe reacting based off of the data you get from your students. Like those kind of concepts definitely do overlap. But as an instructional designer, you're not often in front of an audience facilitating something. You're not facilitating these sessions. You're behind the scenes. So I'm sure as a social worker, you have some very transferable skills. So communication skills, I'm sure some sort of analysis skills, like when you're analyzing the situation, like collecting all the data you can to identify the best solution for this situation. Like instructional design is so interdisciplinary that I think it would be very hard to find a career or a position that doesn't have some sort of overlap with the instructional design space. So there are definitely people coming from development backgrounds, education backgrounds, UX backgrounds, like people are coming from all over. So I wouldn't worry about that. Don't be discouraged by that. I've even seen some job postings that say like in all caps, like no teachers or K through 12 educators, like none of those applications will be considered. And I think it's because there is such an influx of these teachers who say, I've been teaching in the classroom, I have enough experience, I'm just going to submit my resume to all these instructional design jobs without actually putting together a portfolio or having any meaningful ID experience. So I think some organizations are actually getting frustrated, it seems like, with these applications, and they're just saying, we're not going to consider these at all. So don't feel discouraged by that. Like use your social work background to, leverage that, talk about the transferable skills, because that's going to make you more unique. And for anyone, no matter what your background is, like you need to work on telling your story of instructional design. Like be comfortable talking about how your background and your experiences have led you into this becoming a passionate and competent instructional designer. And I think everyone can craft that story. You just need to think about it and draw up those examples, because that's what you're going to need to talk about in interviews. All right. Elsa asks, would I recommend former teachers or education professionals include offline curriculum projects in one's portfolio? Elsa, I don't think that it can hurt, especially if you're just trying to get something up. Like, some hiring managers do look for variety in portfolios. So to have a face-to-face session on there, like, that's a good idea. Like, my first portfolio, I had a mix of e-learning. I had a face-to-face session. I had like infographics, a podcast. I had all sorts of stuff until I decided, okay, I really want to focus on this e-learning thing. And obviously, because of the current global situation, the demand for e-learning is much higher than face-to-face training. But if you already have something, do a write-up about it, talk about how it applies to, talk about your instructional design process, not your teaching process. And you can use that to get some credibility in the ID space, I would say. Don't do it, but one example like that would be fine when you're just getting your portfolio off the ground. All right. Oh, it looks like the questions got out of order. But I see a question here from Rochelle with 9 upvotes. It seems like people who hire for ID roles are very wary of teachers because they get lots of applications from teachers who don't really understand ID. However, so many of those experiences are a huge asset. How can former teachers sell themselves better? So Rochelle, spot on with that observation. We were just talking about that. I think the best opportunities you have to sell your experience as a teacher would be what I mentioned earlier. Like lesson planning, if you were working with objectives and aligning your lesson to those objectives, that is like textbook instructional design, basically. So communicate that, how you can hopefully, learn how to create strong objectives. I've seen some K through 12 like state created learning objectives, and they're like we use those in my master's program as examples of what not to do when writing objectives. So I don't know what kind of understanding teachers have of good objectives, but definitely take the time to learn that. And then talk about your experiences aligning practice activities, content, all of that to objectives. So, and like coming up with comprehensive lesson plans. Like, are you just presenting at students for 45 minutes? Or are you being intentional about, giving practice opportunities and making these lessons more engaging? Because those type of things are very relevant to instructional design. And then, like I said, if you want to just take that a step further, think about times where you're adjusting your instruction or adjusting your lesson plan based off of data you're getting from the students. So whether that's pre-test data or everyone failing a quiz or students even seeming distracted and you having to adjust, that is a very ideal instructional design skill, like being able to look at the data and adjust accordingly. Not always done in practice, but that's the type of thing you'll be able to talk about in interviews to show that you know your stuff when it comes to the full scope of instructional design. Cool deal. Let me scroll through here and see if there are any much more upvoted ones. Ingrid, great question. Is it okay if portfolios contain fake projects? Yes, 1000%. Don't feel like you need to include real stuff in your portfolio. Some of the best feedback I've gotten is from my practice projects, ones I did just for like class projects or just like projects I wanted to do to play around with new technology. Those ones are the heavy hitters. A lot of the real client work isn't very exciting. It's kind of boring. Again, a lot of it is just like info dump stuff. Hiring managers aren't going to sit there and go through all of that. So yeah, definitely it's okay if it's fake. Like, the process we go through in my bootcamp about creating that flagship project, we come up with this real world problem that we can solve for a client, even if that client isn't actually coming to us to get that problem solved in real life. We're acting as if they do, and the reason for that is because we're showing how we use this ID skill set to solve someone else's problem that comes to us. And you can mention that it's a concept piece. Like, don't say, oh, this was for Nike and they paid me to do this. Like, that's just lying. But you can still talk about, you can say, this is a concept piece that I created to solve this problem for a mid-sized software company in the United States. You're saying it's a concept piece, but you also have that audience very clearly outlined. So it is that. And when I was doing projects, I was like, yeah, this is for like a nutrition class, like a health and wellness class, to teach them about like what a vegan is. Like I did a project like that. A professor didn't come to me and pay me to make that, but I present it as like, if I were faced with this real world problem or this real world need, this is the type of solution I could create for that. So definitely do that. You can even do like concept pieces. Like I have one for Beyond Meat. I like the brand. I agree with their mission. So I made a quick like concept piece to present their products and their mission. So good question. You do not need to only have real projects. Let's see what else. I see we have a couple of minutes left. I see another. Okay, we have. I'll try to get to a couple more questions. I see one with 5 upvotes, one with 8. So we have a question from Adi. How much leverage does an ID with strong usual ID stuff like content analysis, storyboarding, etc., with an intermediate skill set in coding and graphic design tools have over those with no coding or graphic design tools skill set? Okay, so Adi's question here is like, how much more valuable are you if you're an ID who can do these more technical and graphic design pieces versus an ID who can't do those pieces? And I would say in today's climate, much more valuable. So I'm one of those instructional designers. I've spent a ton of time diving into the technical side of things, JavaScript, XAPI, and I definitely make an effort to include my visual designs, like improve my visual design skills. And from day one, that well-rounded skill set is what landed me a lot of my projects. Like I love doing the development projects, like pure e-learning development, pure JavaScript, HTML, CSS, and because those are my most profitable projects and they're easiest for me. I'm getting a little bit off topic with that, but if you can do a good job with all of those skills, yeah, clearly, like, can I pay this person one salary and they can do all of these things well, or do I have to pay 2 salaries and hire 2 people to accomplish these same projects? So I would recommend not to spread yourself too thin. Like make sure you're not doing all these things like, okay. The graphic design stuff, like you don't need to create graphics from scratch, right? Like you can hire a graphic designer. There will be graphic designers you can work with. But to have to be able to lay out the slides yourself and to make it look professional and visually appealing, that will demand higher value, I would say, from clients and when you're applying to full-time jobs. And okay, good. I see we're out of time, so I know some people will have to hop off. I'm just going to get to this last question right here with 11 votes. Do I recommend pursuing a certificate or formal paid training to become an ID, or can self-guided free resources be useful? Which would you recommend? I think I've seen a lot of responses to this in the chat, so I won't dive super far into this. Like, you can definitely do this for free, okay? Like, you don't need to do a master's program. You don't need to do any paid boot camps. Like, you don't have to do all of that stuff. There is so much free information and community out there to help you along your journey. I think the benefit of paid programs are to get some of that more individual feedback, right? Like, if someone can give you feedback and tell you something, that could have a very big difference in whether or not you land a job. That can make a big difference. Like that boot camp or whatever it is, like if you spend $1,000 or $2,000 on a boot camp and then you land a job making 20 grand more than you would have otherwise, it can probably pay off. And likewise, these kind of paid programs can help you get where you're going faster in a lot of cases. So you can definitely learn all of this stuff on your own and piece together all of the information. And I try to make it, make playlists and stuff to make this stuff as accessible as possible. But if you have someone who has this like designated program who laid it all out for you and is providing you support along the way, it can obviously help you get there a bit faster. So that's my take on it. Like, you definitely don't need to do any kind of paid offering, but it can help you land better opportunities or get where you're going faster if you get the right feedback or you get that nice curated learning path. So hope that helps, but that will be a, personal decision about which route you want to go with that. All right, so thank you for all of these good questions. I'm sorry we cannot get to all of them. I do have a Slack community where some of these questions would be great. We have tons of IDs in there who would be happy to help answer them. So if you're not already in there, you would have received an invite when you signed up for this session. And I just want to shout out, next week we're doing a live Q&A with Christy Tucker about scenario-based learning. So if you've ever looked into scenario-based learning or branching scenarios, you've probably come across some of Christy's stuff, and she'll be here live with us in exactly 1 week, and we will dive into all of that. So it'll be a great session. Thank you, everyone. I hope that everything that was going on in the chat was helpful, and I will see you all next week.